government should remove statues of British figures involved in the slave trade. Further, will she agree with me that the lives of black people who have died following contact with police, like Sarah Reid and Rashant Charles, are worth more than any statue?
She will be well aware, and perhaps she would like to lobby local authorities across the country to bring about the changes to statues. And I noticed the Honourable Lady celebrated the violence and protest and placards have left the Labour Party with the departure of the Right Honourable Member for...
And get knives off the street, which not just Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter.
When it comes to meeting the parents of young black men who have been murdered on the streets of London, is the significance of stop and search when it comes to taking weaponry off our streets. And I think it is important for all members of this House to recognise, and when I've seen those parents and when I've sat with them and heard of their stories, they themselves call for more lives being killed and to prevent more criminal and violent activities on the streets.
What's your take on this debate? Drop your opinion in the comments below, and let's see where the real public stands on this issue.
Constituents demanding we decry racism and police brutality, and I absolutely applaud that. One such constituent, Zora, second-generation British Indian, chartered accountant and mum of 3 children, asks me, according to inquest, the proportion of BAME deaths in custody where restraint is a feature is twice as many as other deaths in custody. To build trust with communities, what can the Secretary of State tell us government is doing?
Facts and figures around deaths in police custody. In 2018-19, there were 16 deaths in custody, of whom 15 individuals were from a white background and 1 was black. It is important that obviously the IOPC looks at all investigations and these custodies take place, and that is exactly
what unfolded in Parliament during this exchange was not just a routine policy debate, it was a politically charged confrontation that exposed one of the deepest divisions in modern British politics: how the country defines justice, policing, and historical accountability. The session began with a highly sensitive and emotionally loaded question about Britain's historical legacy and modern racial justice. The initial challenge focused on whether statues linked to Britain's involvement in the slave trade should be removed, and then quickly expanded into references to deaths of black individuals following contact with police. From the very start, the framing of the question carried moral weight, suggesting a direct comparison between historical symbolism and present-day institutional harm. This immediately set a confrontational tone in the chamber, but the response shifted the direction of the entire debate. Instead of remaining focused on historical monuments and symbolic justice, the discussion moved sharply toward policing policy and public safety. The introduction of stop-and-search measures and knife crime prevention reframed the issue entirely. The phrase "all lives matter" became a critical turning point in the exchange, intensifying the political temperature and signaling a shift from symbolic justice arguments toward practical law and order policy. At that moment, the debate stopped being about history and became about policing philosophy. One side emphasized systemic concerns, public trust, and the need to address perceived inequalities in policing outcomes. The other side focused on crime prevention, arguing that stop-and-search policies save lives by reducing violence and removing weapons from the streets. This fundamental disagreement transformed the exchange into a direct clash of ideologies rather than a discussion of policy details. As the debate continued, the tension escalated further with references to deaths in police custody, statistical comparisons between demographic groups, and the role of oversight bodies such as the Independent Office for Police Conduct. Each side used data selectively to reinforce their position, but instead of narrowing the disagreement, the statistics deepened it. One narrative pointed towards systemic injustice and disproportionate harm experienced by minority communities. The opposing narrative emphasized official records, broader demographic figures, and institutional accountability processes to argue that policing outcomes are being properly monitored and investigated. What makes this exchange particularly significant is not just the content of the arguments, but how quickly it escalated from a question about statues into a full-scale ideological confrontation over policing in Britain. The chamber became a space where two completely different interpretations of justice were presented, one rooted in historical and social critique, the other rooted in security, enforcement, and procedural legitimacy. The moment "all lives matter" entered the discussion, the tone shifted again. For some, it represented an inclusive framing of public safety concerns. For others, it was interpreted as a deflection from the specific issues raised about racial injustice and policing accountability. That single phrase intensified the division rather than resolving it, becoming a symbolic flashpoint that reflected the broader political disagreement. As the exchange progressed, it became clear that neither side was speaking only about the immediate question. Instead, both were projecting wider political narratives onto the debate, narratives about Britain's history, its policing system, and the meaning of equality under law. This is why the discussion became so heated and why procedural interventions from the speaker were required to maintain order. Ultimately, what we witnessed was not just disagreement over policy, but a collision of worldviews. One worldview prioritizes institutional continuity, public order, and crime reduction as the primary measure of justice. The other prioritizes historical accountability, lived experience, and structural inequality as the central lens for evaluating the same institutions. And because these two frameworks interpret the same facts in fundamentally different ways, compromise becomes difficult and tension becomes inevitable. The exchange also highlights how modern parliamentary debates are no longer confined to technical policy discussions. Instead, they increasingly reflect broader cultural conflicts that extend far beyond the chamber. Issues like policing, race, history, and public safety are now deeply interconnected, and any discussion of one quickly triggers arguments about all the others. In this case, what began as a question about statues evolved into a national-level debate about policing legitimacy, statistical interpretation, and moral responsibility. The speaker's interventions were necessary not because of a single remark, but because the conversation had escalated into a broader ideological standoff that risked losing procedural control.